Nice to have you with us.
Or puppy.
Yeah. Good morning. And so we've got, we're sort of at capacity here, is that?
Should I put the thing on?
Yeah, why don't you?
Okay.
And so to our most recent guest visitor, sir?
Yeah.
Morning.
Oh, Mike Pulowski, True North Reports.
True enough, thank you. Yeah, good morning, welcome.
Can we break the rule for Honor so we're up to 19 and which we,
Yeah, does she want to come in?
Honor, do you want to come in? If,
Are you guys finishing up the last conversation? Because I can wait.
no, we're starting now.
Okay, thanks.
Everybody's okay?
Are we okay with that one more? Should I put, I'll put this fan on.
I'm gonna put my mask on too.
Right, so Beth, you want to come up to the table, and if folks want to,
I think Laura's gonna send me a Zoom link and I can share my screen, but you should already have the draft as well.
There we go.
We have the draft.
do we have it too?
It should be posted now. You guys can just refresh it.
It's there.
Okay.
Okay, I think you got it.
Rodney, Shawnee told me he had to fuss with this thing and connections were screwed up. Magnetic.
Okay, share screen.
He was scratching his head.
Yeah.
Okay. Would you like me to begin?
Well, maybe at the beginning, is that a good?
Oh, yes, do you want me to?
Sorry.
Beginning
Yes,
place.
yes.
That's St. James Office of Legislative Counsel. You should have posted on your website, and I'm sharing my screen, draft 1.1 of your committee's strike all amendment to H-165 as introduced. You're going to see lots of yellow. I apologize, but I find that that is the easiest way to show the changes between the introduction and your amendment. So I apologize for any headaches it causes. I will just note before we dig in that this is to come full circle, potpourri of lots of different conversations you all have had over the last couple weeks. So if I have missed the mark or you have moved on from something or changed your mind, please just speak up and we can make changes. But I tried my best to incorporate everything you all have talked about over the last couple weeks in here. So some of it might be stale at this point.
Yeah, I think that if we come to a point where somebody has a question about whether in fact that's what we had agreed to, we'll flag that. And then if we come to something where, you want to have a conversation about it, even if it's something that we, didn't agree to earlier, flag that as well. And I just wanted to say for newer members, strike all amendment may be a new term,
Okay, great.
if you want to explain that.
Sure. So once you have possession of a bill, you can make changes to it. And the way you do that is through proposing amendments. And there's a couple different ways you can do that. One is an instance of amendment. So if you didn't like a word on a certain line, or you wanted to change something or a few things that are small and concrete, instead of having 18 pages of a bill, you would, I would draft a document for you that says on this line, we're going to make this change. And on this line, we're going to make this change. And then those are the only changes to the bill as introduced. And then that would eventually, if voted by your peers, if your peers voted that those changes out, they would be incorporated into the bill when it makes its way to the other body. A strike all amendment is just what it sounds like. You are striking the entire bill as introduced and proposing new language. So you will see language underlined, which is new language, but it also appears in the bill as introduced. So you might be thinking, but that's old language because it was in the bill as introduced. But in a strike all amendment, you're treating your document that you're working with, your amendment, just as a brand new language. You're striking everything and you're starting over. Most strike all amendments keep a ton of language from the introduced bill, which you will see in here. But if you make more than a couple instances of amendment, it just really makes more sense and is more clear to just do a strike all. So the highlighting represents, in this draft, represents the differences between the bill as introduced and your amendment. And we can always do a side-by-side, which is a document that I could create that literally shows you section by section and on the same page what the differences are between as introduced and your amendment. Usually you see that between a House and a Senate version, or House Ag and House Ed. But it's certainly, if we need to, it's certainly something we could do for any version of a document that you're looking at. Is that clear as mud? Okay.
Representative O'Brien.
So if we're interspersing this with existing Vermont statute, how does that work? Because you've got as introduced, right? And then you've got the statute, existing statute, and then we'd have perhaps the strike all.
So this is pretend like this is, the best way to think of a strike all amendment is just a new bill. So nothing, you haven't created, the bill as introduced hasn't created any new law yet because the governor hasn't signed anything. You haven't voted anything out. So anything you're proposing in your amendment, if you're proposing to add something to law, it's still going to be underlined. It's still going to appear as new, a new suggestion. And if you're looking at making changes to current law, you're still going to see that current law as just plain, no underlining, no strike through. And then deletions or repeals, you're going to see that strike through language. So it's exactly the same as the bill as introduced, but you are proposing further changes to that bill. And because you're striking out everything, you're just starting over essentially. So it'll look almost exactly the same. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. It's not, the more you work with it, the more straightforward it'll be, and it'll probably make more sense once we dig into the language. Is that, okay. Yeah. So we start with a little preamble, and since there are new folks here, I do think usually we skip right over the preamble, but I do think it's helpful to orient yourself to when you're making amendments to bills as introduced. There's going to be this little preamble that orients folks to what they're looking at, what the document does. So the Committee on Agriculture, Food Resiliency and Forestry, to which was referred House Bill number 165, entitled, and then the title, respectfully reports that it has considered the same and recommends that the bill be amended by striking out all after the enacting clause and inserting in lieu thereof the following. And so I have made no changes to the findings section. So we're going to skip right over that. We're going to go to page 3. And you'll see various different reader assistance headings in here. If you don't like them or you think that they are not helpful, please give me feedback on them. But they're really just to orient the reader on kind of the category that they are, the language they're about to look at falls under. So for this bill, we're looking at the school food programs, and section 2 is an amendment to subchapter 2 in chapter 27, which is the school food programs subchapter. So the first change you'll see here is a new definition in the definition section. You'll see all this language, right? Current law. Approved independent school on line 15. This is language that was added in the bill as introduced. I haven't heard any desire to change that, so it still appears here underlined as a proposal to add to law, but it hasn't changed since the bill was introduced, so I didn't highlight it. So a new definition that we are adding is the universal meal supplement, and this actual language is taken directly out of the bill as introduced. So the concept is not different, but it was a recommendation from AOE, and I think it was a great recommendation. Rather than writing all of this language out multiple times, let's just refer to the universal meal supplement. So universal meal supplement means the reimbursement amount paid by the state for the cost of a paid breakfast or lunch under the federal school breakfast and federal school lunch programs, which shall be, and we're on page 4 now, a sum equal to the federal reimbursement rate for a free school breakfast, less the federal reimbursement rate for a paid school breakfast using rates identified annually by AOE from payment levels established annually by USDA, and then the same thing for lunch. So that's what we're referring to when we're referring to the universal meal supplement. Any questions?
Representative O'Brien?
So just to make it clear for all of us, this doesn't exist in the green books. We're using some definitions, but right, because it's just in rules, what we passed so far because of last year.
Session law.
Session law, right.
Yes, so approved, yes. So anything you see underlined here is a proposal to add it to this section in Title 16 in the green books. The definition of approved independent school was in the session law from last year. Universal meal supplement, a definition of with that term appearing in the definition section did not exist either in the session law or in this bill as introduced. But the substance of the definition appeared both in the session law and in the bill as introduced. We're just making a definition.
So this definition that we're adding here is a little bit of arithmetic, it seems like. So it's a sum of two numbers.
Yes, so this is the universal meal supplement is what the state is paying.
Yeah.
And that is, you're taking.
The breakfast.
Yep, it's the same math for breakfast and lunch. There's just gonna be different numbers because it costs different amounts to make the different meals. But it's gonna be the rate for a free school breakfast minus or less the federal reimbursement rate for a free school breakfast minus the federal reimbursement rate for a paid school breakfast. So the federal government is paying more for a free school breakfast because that's all federal money. They're paying a tiny little bit for the paid meals. What's left over is what kiddos would be paying in line if they were getting the breakfast or the lunch, the paid meal. Now the state's picking that up.
So any questions about the computation there? I guess I'm just, now that I'm looking at it, I'm wondering whether the word sum should also be at the beginning of section B or subsection B. Because
It is.
it should be there. Because we're adding something, we're adding two things.
Oh, I see what you're saying. No, and that's a great, so part of this process is you pointing out language that I have drafted that is not clear. That's part of this process. So no, I did not mean for this. The intent is not that this isn't, you add A to B.
Okay, so
I will make that more clear.
okay.
It's that,
Want to come up, Julia? Or should we flag it and come back to? Yeah.
May I
just say one thing?
Sure, yeah.
Julia Richter, Joint Fiscal Office. The way that I read this language is the sum is referring to all of the supplements for the breakfast in A, and then the sum in B is all of the supplements for lunch. So it's two sums.
And that was the intent, but it does no good if people find that confusing. So I hear you, and I can think about a way to make that more clear.
I think semantically, in this situation, sum would mean amount, not the result of an equation necessarily. So maybe the word sum should be changed to an amount equal to.
Maybe, yeah, that might be the solution, or at least we can, play with that and see what we come up with. Okay. Yes, Representative Cole.
I just wanted to thank you for adding this because I think it's super important to note sort of the complexity in actually determining the costs. So this is really helpful.
Thank AOE, because this was not my idea.
Okay.
I can't take credit for it. I did draft it. Again, this language is not new language. It was in, it's new language because you're adding it to the green books in this bill, but it was in Act 151 from last year, and it was in this bill as introduced. It just didn't appear in the same situation, if you will. So I'm glad that this is helpful.
Representative O'Brien?
Can you explain, there's free lunch, we hear this free and reduced, and then sort of the full freight, which is full, but, what's happening to the reduced? Is that just lumped in?
Yeah, so the federal government does provide a piece of, they pay for some of the reduced, they pay for the reduced part. And then the state of Vermont has been paying for the rest of it for those students. I'm not sure for how long, but for quite a while out of the general fund. So the free meals are covered exclusively by the federal government. The reduced price meals are covered currently by money from the federal government and money from the state general fund. And the paid meals currently, because of Act 151, the state is paying for. But prior to Act 151 and prior to COVID, that was just the family paying. Or if a school district had a universal meals program, that was coming out of their general fund for the school district.
So what qualifies a student for the reduced?
Oh, that I can't speak to off the top of my head.
Something less restrictive than free, but
Right.
yeah, there's, I'm income bracket about that.
So household income levels that fall between a certain percentage and a different percentage. I think the 185% of federal poverty level is the top number. And then the other number is something below that, but I'm not sure what it is.
Right.
But
I can certainly look that up. I just wasn't prepared to speak to that during this walkthrough. And there may be folks in this room who could answer that off the top of their head.
yeah, okay.
Can we move on from this?
Well, I think we have one more question.
Brief question. You refer to the general fund. Is that as opposed to the ed fund?
Correct.
None of this has come out of the ed fund.
No.
Heretofore.
So the portion of the reduced price meals that the state has paid for a while and currently pays for, that you are not proposing to change in any way with this bill, comes out of the state general fund. Act 151 and the universal meals supplement for this current school year is coming out of the education fund. And this bill proposes that the universal meal supplement should come out of the education fund going forward.
And then I would just add that yesterday we heard testimony that there have historically been some other, like, maybe hidden costs, that's not the best word, that have come out of the ed fund. For example, if there are meal costs that go uncollected and the district has to pay for those, they ultimately come out of the education fund. Schools that have budgeted on their own to pay for universal meals. That comes ultimately out of the education fund, but not off the top of the education fund. That's a distinction. And that was when we were trying to figure out, how much is that yesterday, and not able to get a handle on an exact number, but.
Yes.
Okay, I think we're okay to keep scrolling.
Okay. So the next section is kind of a big change, but you can't really see it because it's moving language. So currently in Title 16 in the school food programs subchapter, there is an award of grants section. And that talks about how how grants or reimbursements are calculated for the various different pieces of the school food program that the state funds. Some of that is money to start a program, kind of like kickstart money. Some of that is the money to pay for the reduced price, the portion, pick up the state's portion of the reduced price meals. All of that enabling language and kind of math appears in this award of grants section. H-165 as introduced also included language in section 1262A, award of grants, about how the universal meal supplement would be awarded. Most of that language was the language that's now the definition of the universal meal supplement, right? We're doing the math of the free school breakfast minus the federal reimbursement rate, and that's the universal meal supplement. But there was concern about whether there needed to be an annual appropriation for the universal meal supplement every year in a policy bill. And from what I understood from the committee's desire was that this was just kind of an automatic every year, like categorical aid for transportation reimbursement coming off the top of the ed fund without anyone having to draft a policy bill making that appropriation. To do that, I've taken the language that was in this section as introduced and plunked it somewhere else lower in the bill in a different subchapter within Title 16 related specifically to education funding, and I'll explain how that works when we get there. But for the purposes of this walkthrough, what your amendment does is in this award of grants. So the award of grants section talks about all the different types of grants, all the different categories of programs that the state is paying for under the school meals subchapter. We're referring universal meal supplements on line 11 shall be awarded in accordance with section 417 of this title, which is a new section that's taking that language, we're taking that language, plunking it in this new section 4017, which comes later. So we're just making a reference to it here. That will make more sense when we look at section 4017. But the way the bill is drafted, they can't appear back to back like that. I can change that going forward, but just know we're coming to the place where there will be clarity. So this is a change, not so much in the substance of what the law that you are drafting. It's we're plunking it in a different section of Title 16, and that actually means something big as far as the education fund is concerned. You want me to move on? Okay. So the school food program, we're on line 14 here. This is the statute that talks about schools having the school food programs. And so you'll see on page 5 here, this is this underlined language here in subdivision B. This is the same as from the bill is introduced, hasn't changed at all. So subdivision A is saying that public schools have to operate a school food program under the National School Lunch Act and the Child Nutrition Act. And then now we're saying not only do they have to do that, they also have to offer meals to every student at no charge every day, public schools. And then approved independent schools that do operate a school lunch and school breakfast program, they can offer, if they offer students, an attending student every school day, a meal to every attending student every school day at no charge, they could qualify for the universal meal supplement. So this lines 5 through 10 is just a little bit of wordsmithing. I think you received feedback from AOE that this was just not clear. The intent of it and the meaning behind it has not changed since the bill as introduced and Act 151. So public schools, we're saying you have to do it. We can't force independent schools to run these food programs. But if they want to qualify for the universal meal supplement, they have to run the school food programs, and they have to offer free meals to every student every day. And then we're not making any changes to subdivision C, which is all of those pieces that are seeking to achieve the highest level of student participation in the meals. So letting kiddos pick up breakfast, making breakfast available to students in classrooms, some wellness community advisory council involvement. So no changes there.
This is may rather than shall.
Where are you?
May include line 13.
Mm-hmm.
So it's essentially a list of suggestions or planning ideas in schools' heads, and they can use them or not. Is that, and
Yes.
also for anyone who might read it to better imagine how they might do this.
Yeah, so there's kind of two levels here. One is that a school district and an improved independent school shall seek to achieve the highest level of student participation, and they may do that by, so these are suggestions to achieve that directive. Does that make sense?
Yes, yeah. Representative O'Brien?
Is there at approved independent schools, is there a percentage of students who are going there on public tuition that triggers this? Or could you have, one or two students out of 100 potentially, and would that qualify everybody at that school potentially?
Yes, there's no public student percentage, public tuition percentage trigger built into this. But what is built in is that the state is only paying for those students on public tuition. So the independent school would then have to figure out how they are going to cover the costs of the free meals for all the other students. And that's the question that Rosie has out to USDA, that they have historically interpreted. And I think we've talked about how black and white reading of the law is great, but if the entity who's actually carrying this out in the field interprets it differently, you need to know that. So I think historically, this state has interpreted, has believed that independent schools covering those costs through general tuition is fine. It's not running afoul of the federal meals program requirements for not charging per meal fees for a free meal. But we don't know for sure that is how USDA will interpret that.
Representative Cole?
Yeah, with these options of laying out how these meals can be provided, and they're all options, they're not requirements, of course. I know my school and I think other schools have been in hallway cart options for food during the day, especially in trying to deal with the line length issue or the short amount of time allocated to eating lunch. And so it seems like that would still be okay with this, but I just wanted to make sure because I think it is important to avoid that concern of not having enough time to eat lunch.
So there's nothing in here that specifies specifically how they have to maximize highest level of student participation. So those are not exclusionary. They're just suggestions. Let's see.
I think the only place that could prohibit that from happening would be if there were a section that would say that this has to take place in the cafeteria, which it seems like it doesn't based on these options offered.
No, there's nothing in the language that you are looking at or proposing to amend that talks about specifically where a meal needs to be served.
Okay. Yeah, good.
The next section has not changed at all since the bill was introduced, and that's repealing section 1265 in Title 16, which is the exemption for public schools. So there is currently a requirement that public schools run the school food, the federal school food programs, but there's an exemption process for them to be exempt from that requirement. And H-165 is introduced, and your amendment proposes to repeal that exemption. So there is no way to opt out of running a federal school meals program for public schools. And that this section was temporarily suspended for 1 year in Act 151.
So that it's consistent with what's happening now in Vermont this school year.
Yes, but only because of Act 151. Prior to Act 151, I believe there were at least 1 or 2 schools that did go through this exemption process. But AOE would, I'm sure, be able to speak what happened to them. And
I think, yeah, we took testimony on that. I think there were 2. Okay.
so no changes to that repeal. Okay, so this is the big change I was talking about regarding funding. So now we're still in Title 16, we're still in the education title. We are out of the school food subchapter, which is also where the incentive grant program lives. So we're out of the food specific home in Title 16, and we are now in the education funding subchapter, which is the very last subchapter in Title 16. It is where the permission, it is where most of the categorical aid sections live there. There are some sprinkled that are kind of larger, like flexible pathways and special ed. They live in their own subchapters. But things like school merger grants, transportation reimbursement, English language learners, categorical aid, things that come right off the top of the ed fund. They live in this subchapter or this chapter 133. And so what I am proposing to do to address your concern about the universal meal supplement being treated as categorical aid that just comes, and I know that the finance folks hate the term comes off the top of the ed fund. I just want to acknowledge that, but I think that is the term that you all, it kind of clicks with you all as far as the conceptualizing how it works. I'm taking language that was previously up in that award of grant section and plunking it here. We're creating a new section in this ed fund chapter talking about how do we calculate the universal meal supplement? What is it? So it's all yellow because it's in a new place, but the language, there's been some tweaks based on AOE feedback, but the substance of it is the same as H-165 as introduced. So the definition of universal meal supplement was specific to that subchapter. So I'm making a reference to it here so that no one has to flip, so they know that the universal meal supplement definition applies to this section too. And then for subsection B, the universal meals supplement is from state funds appropriated to the agency from the education fund for the universal meal supplement. The agency shall provide a universal meal supplement for the cost of each meal actually provided to each student in the district during the previous quarter when meals are offered to all students at no charge pursuant to subdivision 1264A 1B. That's that program language that we talked about where all of those ways to maximize student participation live of this title. And then again, that was the substance is the same, but there was some wordsmithing here because now we're using the universal meal supplement as a term. I don't have to list out all of that, a sum equal to anymore. That's why the language is highlighted in yellow because it is different than how it appears when the bill is introduced. This part has not changed at all. We're on page 8. Reimbursement from state funds shall be available only to districts that maximize access to federal funds for the cost of the school breakfast and lunch program by participating in CEP or provision 2 of these programs or any other federal provision that in the opinion of the agency draws down the most possible federal funding for meals served in that program. That language hasn't changed from the bill is introduced. This next part is direct response to a recommendation from AOE. At the start of each school year, and we're on line 6, the Agency of Education may require that a school food authority requesting the universal meal supplement begin a new cycle of the relevant federal provision and group sites in a manner the agency determines will maximize the drawdown of federal funds. I believe that was in response to the new way that Medicaid eligibility will be used to determine eligibility for these school food programs.
So, yeah, we had some testimony from AOE and acknowledged that there would be some administrative work required at the district level, school district level, but that the benefit of maximizing the drawdown of federal funds would make up for that.
And then, so we're, just to go back up a little bit, just to orient you. So we're in this universal meal supplement section. We've got a definition subsection. So we're still under the public school umbrella here. You're going to see almost exactly the same language for approved independent schools coming up, with some small differences because of the difference between the public schools and independent schools. But so subdivision 2 under this public schools umbrella is second breakfasts as allowed under 7 CFR section 220.9 subsection A do not qualify for reimbursement under this subsection. I will say the only term that I've heard used in this committee is the term second breakfasts. But when I look at the federal regulation here, they use the term excess breakfast. So if second breakfast is just a term of art that the field prefers to use, I don't think there's anything wrong with using it. But I just wanted to note that that term second breakfast doesn't actually appear in that federal regulation. Second breakfast seems a lot friendlier than excess breakfast. So I just wanted to point that out.
So, and also just to be clear, so CFR, something federal regulation?
The Code of Federal Regulation,
Okay.
yes. So it's like your state rules. It's the federal rules.
Yeah. Okay. So this is, we're talking about something that is not, this has nothing to do with what anything in Vermont statute. This is second breakfast as allowed.
It's part of the food program regulations. And they talk about how to use I can pull it up if you want.
And sorry, I know I don't. I
Okay,
didn't
great.
go down that rabbit hole. Just wanted to be sure that.
Yes, this is in relation to the federal rules. There is an allowance for second breakfast, excess breakfast. And here you're saying the state's not going to cover those. Yes. So.
Representative O'Brien?
So is there language that the AOE is gonna enforce that maximizing of federal dollars? Like who decides? Like you know, public school, you didn't do what you could have.
We've left that up to AOE.
So the schools will look at that for guidance.
Yes, let's see.
And maybe it would be helpful, I think in this language, it's clear that, you need to be a part of either the CEP or provision 2. And that in itself, hopefully I think it should be sufficient to recognize, like, especially if you're enrolling at the beginning of the year, that you're maximizing those federal funds. So if a school isn't a part of either of those programs, then that would be a sign that they're not, but I don't think that would happen.
Will those change though with the coming Medicaid data
Yes.
too?
Well, it will determine whether a school falls into the CEP or the provision 2 category because of that Medicaid data. And likely more schools are gonna fall under that CEP category than before because of this Medicaid provision.
So do either of you feel that we need to do something to the language here for clarity or encouragement?
So I'm looking right here. So page 8, it's the opinion of the agency draws down the most possible federal funds. So you've delegated that authority to AOE.
And those are still gonna be the only two pathways though, right?
No, so the language is clear. I think those will be the most my understanding is those will be the most common pathways. So the language says reimbursements are only going to be made to districts that maximize access to federal funds, so maximize access to federal funds, by participating in CEP provision 2 or any other federal provision that in the opinion of the agency draws down the most possible federal funding for the meals served in that program, leaving open the possibility that there might be some school situations where another provision, and I'm not familiar with all of them, I believe there's at least 2 more, might draw down the most federal funds. So you're leaving that open, but hitting on the 2 most common as an example. Does that make sense? Okay. So the next biggest piece is, remember, we're still under the public school award of grants here. Subdivision 3. This is to address pre-qualified private pre-kindergarten providers, so the daycare centers. Pre-K in public schools already qualify under the language that's in front of you because they are considered part of a public school. So subdivision 3 says, and this is new language I added last night based on your conversations. I certainly encourage you to receive feedback on whether this works. A nonprofit, pre-qualified, private pre-kindergarten provider that is qualified, I know that's a mouthful, but it's taken directly from the pre-K statute, pursuant to subsection 829C of this title, that's the pre-kindergarten statute in Title 16, that is not also an approved independent school, is eligible for the universal meal supplement under this subsection if it operates a food program under a public school food authority. So I believe what I tried to do here is sweep in those private nonprofit daycares that are running a federal meals program under the public school food authority.
So Representative Levitt had, before we were gathered, made a comment that I overheard that she may want to make now. Go ahead.
Well, I'm just curious because last week we said 0 to 3, we weren't going to feed, and now this feels like we're feeding 0 to 3. And so my question is sort of a twofold thing, which is A, are we sure we want to do that? And B, this is for the JFO, has that been put in the budget for universal school meals? Because this feels like a new addition and more kiddos are going to get fed, but we haven't costed it out.
So I'll just say, and I'll let you address it too, but at the end of the day yesterday, I had given direction to Beth to, as a, I didn't say as a placeholder, so for the purposes of.
Starting place.
Yeah, we needed to have something there, so that's there. No, I don't consider that the committee has necessarily finalized that, and that's why we're having this conversation. And we can get some confirmation on the numbers, but so what we know is, what somebody knows, is how many actual programs fit this description today. And I believe it's a small number, but I don't know the actual number. I think potentially we also know how many could fit that description that aren't currently, how many, programs there are that aren't currently food service authorities. And then just the other thing I'll add, sort of a policy argument, is that above we've said that pre-K programs that are within public schools, they qualify. What we've done here is say, okay, well, here's another setting where there are pre-K students. We've already said this group of pre-K students will be funded. We're, again, as this is written, we're acknowledging, well, we've got this group covered, we're going to cover this group. And then there is the question about the other below pre-K age students that would also be covered.
That's where I'm getting confused, because when you said private pre-kindergarten, you said childcare center. And to me, I just like an age defined on this, because a public school pre-K, if I'm not mistaken, is like 3 and 4 year olds. but a childcare center can be 0 to 3. So that's where I'm getting, that's where I mean, and I think this is worded really well. To me, a pre-qualified private pre-kindergarten provider, that is a mouthful, isn't it? It sounds like 3 to 4 year olds. It doesn't sound like 0 to 3. So that's where my lack of knowing what that definition is tripping me up.
So I think there's even more nuance to it than just the definition. So a nonprofit pre-qualified private pre-kindergarten provider is, and we're referring back to the pre-K statute because I don't think you want to bring in all of the pre-K language. It's substantial for how to qualify. But we can certainly, whether it's now or another time, pull that up so that you can look at it and decide if you want to bring in some of it for clarity. But I think what you would hear from AOE, I hope, is that this language would automatically sweep in everyone in this center.
Okay.
Without any clarifying language, such as what you're doing for approved independent schools, which is you're only paying for the publicly tuitioned kids.
Got it. Okay.
So without any clarifying language, what AOE did last year in interpreting Act 151 is if there was a private pre-K center that was operating under the public school food authority, and drafting ops had a lot of comments on that term for me. They paid for all the meals.
Okay.
And so without clarifying language here, I believe that this would be interpreted by the field as covering all of the students there.
So just to repeat what you just said, and then I'll go to Representative Rice. If we didn't have this language, we think that AOE, and maybe they've said as much, they would interpret it the same way anyway.
I think, so I don't know, because they interpreted Act 151 the way they did based on Act 151 and conversations that happened around Act 151 and the lack of any direction on that. But you all have had a lot of conversations about this, so I don't know how they would interpret if you didn't include language about daycare centers, private pre-K at all, or you didn't limit it to just publicly tuition. I shouldn't say that. I believe that they would include everyone if you don't limit it to just public tuition. But if you didn't include that language, I don't know that we know how they would interpret it because they're listening to a whole different conversation this year.
Fair enough. Representative Rice.
I just think it's important to note regarding your question about the budgetary impact, that this is how they are already interpreting it this year. And it's still meeting that the budget.
Are they feeding 0 to 3? I was not under the impression that they were.
If they are in this setting.
Okay. Because that felt new to me last week.
Yeah, so right, it was new to everybody. And I think what Beth was just saying was that the way that AOE interpreted this, what's already happening now, this year, was that they needed to be covered.
Okay. I have no problem with covering them. I just want to make sure that we're being fiscally responsible with the cost, because I want to make sure I'm understanding that we're not adding additional monies that we haven't anticipated for 0 to 3. Because I thought 0 to 3 year olds were covered under a different nutrition program.
Some of them are, yeah. So we'll come back to this.
Okay, okay.
This is not, to come back to it, but Representative Lipsky.
Thank you. On Josie's point, during orientation, I asked about early childcare and education funding when we had a presentation by Department of Ed, and the senator who was involved said there are two different categories. Education doesn't begin, Department of Education does not deal with early child care education. That's Department of Children and Families or Agency.
Right.
Remember that?
Yeah.
Late November?
Yeah.
So that was a distinction in November of 2022, late November. I don't know if it was official, but I just wanted to point that out.
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, well, let's keep going here, but.
That part's very-
Flag this anyway. Oh, I'm sorry, Representative O'Brien. Yeah.
Sorry, just to follow up on our chair's point about how many of these providers exist right now who are under school food authorities and potentially how many we could have. How is that relationship arrived at? Because I'm just wondering, you know, if I run one of these private food kindergarten places, can I get in touch with, like, accountability wise, do I call up the local SU or superintendent and say, I want to be part of it, or do they have to be invited in? Can they be kicked out? All these kind of questions, just for budgeting reasons, we should probably know.
That's a great question to field that I'm not able to answer. There's nothing in state law that spells out that process.
Okay.
So I'm not the person to speak to about it. I do think you heard testimony yesterday that there were some programs that were operating school food programs under a public school food authority during the pandemic. And they, as we've transitioned back to today, as we've transitioned, there were some public school food authorities that said they didn't have the capacity to continue to. I believe you heard that testimony yesterday, but as far as how do you establish and maintain that relationship would be a great question for the field.
Yeah, and I think just the other thing that we heard yesterday was that I believe, and we can get clarification if we need to on this, but that hypothetically, if we elected to not pay for the under 3-year-olds, AOE would need an appropriation, $18,000, I think, to do programming that would enable them to collect the data that would differentiate those two subsets. So there would be a cost. There would be savings, presumably from the meals that weren't being covered. But there would be a cost they quantify at $18,000.
Okay.
Okay,
Can I keep going?
let's keep going.
Okay, so subdivision or subsection C on line 18, page 8 is the same information, but for approved independent schools. So most of this is going to be the same, so I'm going to try and gloss over it. So it's the same, from state funds appropriated to AOE. For the universal meal supplement, the agency shall provide a universal meal supplement for the cost of each meal actually provided to each qualifying student on public tuition when meals are offered to all students at no charge. And then again, we're referring back to that program language. Provided that, and then this is where it gets specific to independent schools, but this language largely remains unchanged from the bill as introduced. So if the approved independent school participates in the food programs as a site under a public school food authority, the public school food authority shall be reimbursed only for students attending the approved independent school on public tuition. I believe AOE, without direction, this language was in response to earlier testimony from AOE this session before the bill was even introduced. That there wasn't anything this specific in Act 151. And so if the independent school was under that public school food authority, they were paying for all the meals. Subdivision B, this is the math to figure out how to figure out the number of tuition students. So if the approved independent school participates in CEP or is in a year other than the base year of provision 2, the school shall provide the agency with the number of students attending the school on public tuition and the total number of students enrolled in the school. The agency shall calculate the percentage of students attending the school on public tuition and multiply that number by the paid student percentage, the results of which shall be the number of meals the school shall be reimbursed for. Again, that language appears in the bill as introduced and was a direct response to testimony that the agency provided. Again, you've got the second breakfast prohibition here as well in subdivision 2. And then this section is meant to address what about an approved independent school It's not a daycare facility, it's a school that we think of for K through 12, but they also have a pre-K program. So students attending an approved independent school on public tuition shall include a pre-kindergarten child if the approved independent school also qualifies as a pre-qualified private provider, and the child's school district of residence pays tuition to the school pursuant to section 829 of this title. 829 again is the pre-K section. So this is saying, this is treating pre-K children whose district of residence is paying tuition the same as publicly tuitioned students K through 12. And then on page 10, line subdivision 4, same language from the bill is introduced. An approved independent school is eligible for reimbursement under this subsection. And I should probably change that instead of reimbursement to be the universal meal supplement to be consistent. Only if it operates a food program that makes, only if it operates a school food program. And then reimbursement from state funds shall be available only to the approved independent school. Again, the maximizing access to federal funds. And then that new language at the start of each school year, AOE may require the school food authority to begin a new cycle. And then, I think I can probably, so D is, subsection D is language that was in the bill is introduced. And it's the definition of universal meal supplement. So I think we can probably get rid of that.
It's already defined.
It's already defined. And so the effect of taking all of this language that was in the school food program section of Title 16, the effect of putting it in this part of Title 16 is treating it like categorical aid and allows it to come out of the ed fund as an allowable use of the ed fund, because one of the allowable uses of the ed fund is for other programs that appear in this subchapter. So it's a easy way to kind of sweep it in without having to amend the allowable uses of the education fund or make an annual appropriation. So the effect of this should be that this universal meal supplement would be treated like categorical aid every year. So we're on page 11, I've kept the original appropriation in here with some amendments, just the reference to 16 VSA 4017 used to be a reference to the awards of grants section. But otherwise I've kept the appropriation in here and that is a policy decision for you on whether or not you want to do that.
So the other option would be to communicate with Appropriations Committee.
Correct.
That we would recommend an amount, maybe this amount or maybe some other amount based on the latest and greatest thinking, and ask them to do it that way.
Yes, you haven't made, because these are just proposals to change the law, it's not going to be, the universal meal supplement wouldn't be treated like categorical aid until next fiscal year, right, after the law has taken effect. So if you want to fund this right away, I believe there would need to be an appropriation somewhere.
One way or the other. Representative Levitt?
Quick question. It says eligible entities have the discretion to define what foods are included within the definition of locally produced foods.
We're not there yet.
Okay, sorry. Jumping ahead. Got it.
Oh, any other questions on, okay. So,
Sorry.
and we do have, we had testimony scheduled for 11, but we pushed that back 15 minutes. Do you?
I think this next piece will be quick.
Okay, all right, good.
You want me to keep going?
Yes.
Okay, so section 5 is an amendment to locally produced foods to include approved independent schools. So we're gonna hop all the way down. Oop, just made that bigger. We're gonna hop all the way down to the very end of this. So you'll see there's no underlining here, right? This is all current law for the local food incentives program. But what I've done is at the very end of the section, I've added a definition. Rather than constantly repeat throughout this program, supervisory union or supervisory district or an approved independent school, I've just created a new title called eligible entity and then defined it. So an eligible entity means a supervisory union or supervisory district, or an approved independent school operating a food program as defined by subdivision 1261A1 of this title, that also qualifies for the universal meal supplement pursuant to section 4017.
Sorry, what page are you on there, Beth?
16,
Thank you.
line 17 through 21.
Representative O'Brien?
So this is essentially Act 67 you pulled into here, did it live in?
Act 67. So Act 67 was the vehicle to create the school and the school local foods incentive program. The local food incentive program lives on its own in the green books in perpetuity until you make changes to it.
In Title 16 or something?
In Title 16, yep, right along with the universal meals, free and reduced meals in the school food program subchapter. So this is all current law. So Act 66, 67, 60, okay. That created this program, but it put it into the green books. So you're changing current law, but it's not session law anymore. Or it never was session law. It was always proposed to go into green books.
We all the time talk about Act 250 as though so I think that's sort of shorthand.
Got it.
For.
Okay, sorry. Yep.
But yeah, I mean, different context, obviously, but it was the language that was in Act 67 that's now part of law.
Correct. Yes.
Representative Cole?
This could be a separate conversation, but I'm sort of confused by the concept that it's in the Green Books, Act 67, but there was no appropriation for it in the governor's budget.
That's a policy question.
Okay.
So that piece is kind of, I believe, what you were trying to get at by treating the universal meal supplement as categorical aid. So that there doesn't have to be an annual appropriation. It would be included along with transportation reimbursement and special education funding as one of those chunks of funding that comes right out of the ed fund every year. Very few things come out of the ed fund like that, which is why that special subchapter or special chapter at the end, why putting that language there is actually impactful and meaningful. Programs like this or scholarships or something like that, they'll need annual appropriations every year. And whether that annual appropriation is made or not is a policy decision.
Okay,
Thank you.
all right, let's keep going.
Yep, so created this new definition and then just wove it throughout. There's no other changes. So I'll just scroll all the way up to the beginning of the section. So I'm on page 11, section 5, locally produced foods. So you can see it is the goal of the state that by the year 2023, at least 20% of all foods purchased by, it used to be supervisory unions, and now it says eligible entities, and then a reference to the definition section. And then anywhere that supervisory union was mentioned below, it's eligible entity, which includes approved independent schools that are getting the universal meal supplement. Any questions on that? Okay, so we can skip over all of that horrible yellow highlighting and go to page 17, reports.
I might add one question just on that section there. I kind of lost the word, but oh, here it is. On page 11 at the very bottom, it says on or before December 31st, a program shall report to the AOE an estimate of the percentage of the cost of all foods purchased. And that's referring to local foods.
So remember this is, let's see. So, locally produced foods for the purposes of subsection A and subsection B, which is what you just read from,
Yeah.
is the eligible entity defined definition. Not the consumer protection, local to Vermont definition.
So this, I'm sorry, maybe I'm just not quite understanding so this section B is referring to them needing to calculate specifically their percentage of locally, and under that definition of local
That they create.
that they create, okay,
This is all current law.
okay, cool.
This is as drafted in Act 67.
Oh, yeah, the only reason I was just trying to make that super clear was, because I know in terms of local and of course the Vermont definition, not all schools are doing that right now, so it would be a capacity consideration, so yeah, that's not relevant with this piece.
Not sure I understand your question.
Michael,
I just, so
Yeah.
we got a report that has those numbers. In the local food, report
Yeah.
from AOE. Every SU in this case reported an estimate of, according to their definition of locally sourced, what they were looking, what their percentage was. So they're already doing it,
Cool.
yeah,
For the base year. Mike, right?
for every year. Starting in December
2021, yeah.
31st, 2021, and then annually. They're reporting, they say, what do we call local, and
Yeah.
then what's our percentage of, according to that definition of local food that we're purchasing? And they already reported
thank
that.
you.
Yeah.
Representative, yeah, Dave.
I just have a quick question. So as things are written right now, the local definition is not referring to the commerce one, but it's purely left within the minds of the school board. Is that
There's two definitions, both of them get used at
okay?
different times. So school boards have to, or eligible entities, in current law, it would be the school district, has to report an estimate of the percentage of the cost of the foods purchased using the locally produced foods definition that they create for their district or supervisory union during, for a year. And that definition is used to qualify them for that initial foundational grant to get them into the next phase of the grant. And that is that they've got to develop a purchasing plan, designate a food coordinator, develop the process for tracking, et cetera.
So you said there are two, but it sounds like there are as many definitions as there are entities that are deciding it.
For that, for,
That's,
for the so locally produced foods, for the purposes of, so every year AOE has to give a report. And it might be easier if we look at, the, definition of, or what they have to do in the report.
So that's the last page.
On page, well, the new report,
Okay, yeah.
but in current law, they have to also do a report. And, what we'll look at next is some potential amendments to the next report to give you some extra feedback on this program. So on page 16, current law requires that on or before every January 31st, AOE has to submit to you a report with the information received from eligible entities regarding the percentage of locally produced foods as they define them, in which case there could be as many definitions of locally produced foods as entities.
mhm.
But also, they have to give the percentage of locally produced foods using the grant funding definition, which is that local to Vermont definition.
Got it. So it all does come back to that.
And that local to Vermont definition comes into play when you're looking at how much, so the first definition is used to give you that base grant, get your foot in the door. And then every year after, when you're getting reimbursed for meals, that's when that local to Vermont definition comes in. But AOE wants to know, what are you getting under each definition? Or, I'm sorry, you want to know from AOE what foods fit under each definition. And so the proposal I have here on page 17, to give you some more information to see if that works, is that for next year's report, just for fiscal year 2024, for next year's report, the Agency of Education shall include the following information in the agency's annual local foods incentive grant report, required under the section that we just went over. For locally produced foods as the eligible entities define them, the business name and location of the source of the food, as well as the distance between the source and the school served. And then the same thing for the grant definition.
Can we stop for a second and absorb that? So number one is, as the eligible entities, so as the schools define local, the business name and location of the source, as well as the distance between the source and the schools. Okay, so that gets at the question of fuel usage. And then number two is for locally produced foods, again, as the grant defines them.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, meaning
That,
here now, Vermont,
that's the local to Vermont definition.
again, the business. So what are we actually getting at here then with these two together?
Are you asking me?
Yeah.
Well, I took this, so this is my attempt to meet your goal to get more information on where the food is actually coming from. And so a eligible entity could define local as coming from New York or New Hampshire or Massachusetts. Whereas the grant definition, local to Vermont, would prohibit that. So you could be getting, they could be getting local food to them that's not qualifying towards the grant definition and the reimbursement. And would that information impact your decision about how this program is run going forward?
Yes, Representative Templeman.
So the discrepancy that may exist between one entity's definition and the legal definition that we've established, what process determines those inconsistencies? Is there a person who's actually looking at these reports and saying, oh, New York, no? And then you get, is there a process?
Yes, you.
Oh. Damn.
I had conversations with Chair Durfee about how to help you all move on from, in a productive way, not in a sweep it under the rug way, but how to move on productively of this tension between what does local mean for this program, right? And so one way to do that is to get you information to make an educated decision. And so this is just a first attempt. We can wordsmith this until you are happy. We can take it out. We can, whatever you want. But the first kind of line of defense I was thinking of is to give you information about where the food is coming from, under each definition. And you can analyze that in any way you want. You set the goals of this program. You set the intent of this program. It sounds like you may not have the right information right now to really crystallize that.
Representative O'Brien.
Where did we see the rules that, for example, you could include beverages in this?
Oh, yep. It's not beverages, I believe it's milk.
Liquid milk.
Liquid milk. So local to Vermont as defined in, this is the grant definition. Excluding foods purchased or grown, raised, or produced by the eligible entity that they sold, that they vendored, really, or fluid milk. And I don't know off the top of my head why fluid milk is in there. That, I don't know. I can certainly try and find out.
Do you have a hand up?
Yeah, this is probably a question for Rosie, or maybe we'll hear from her, but going back to the reporting part, she made it pretty clear yesterday that if it wasn't information that they had readily available, they weren't really in favor of having more work to do without extra staffing. I'm wondering if this is information that is available to them already and they can pass along, or if it would take extra personnel to get that information for us.
So I think the way that I'm reading it anyway is we're asking the districts, the schools essentially to compile the information or to submit the information. And then the agency would essentially be compiling it. Is that a fair description or?
Yes, the report language is, we can certainly make it more explicit that the eligible entities have to report this information to AOE and then AOE aggregates it and reports it to you. But the reporting requirement, so this is just saying the reporting requirement that also exists for your next report include this special information. And so the reporting requirement says information received from the eligible entities. So it's,
Yes.
so
I guess just to make the comment of whether it's the agency or schools, I want to be conscientious of what burden we're putting on whoever has to do this information, whether it's the agency or schools, if it's extra work.
Yeah.
We want to be careful.
Representative Cole.
And logistically with that piece, the burden is in part shared by the food hubs, which the schools are purchasing from. So they'll provide that information so the school doesn't have to do that research themselves, like mileage, et cetera, for distance. But yeah, the hubs will play a big role in that too.
Representative Rice.
I was wondering about the hub aspect of this too, because I think as this is written, a school is actually just sourcing food from, the food hub is the source of the food for a lot of this.
Mhm.
And so it might not get at the information and it's possible that we can't get this information in an easily movable way, but you know, if a school is purchasing from a food hub, then the food hub is the business and the distance between the source and the, you know, it would be from the food hub to the school, so.
So you're right, the source of the food may need.
I would encourage you to get feedback on this for language to meet your goals.
Why are we not just adopting for the first category of entities to use the Vermont standard local definition? Why are we leaving it to them to make up their own definition and then we reconcile it later? I don't really understand the value of that. Does anybody understand?
Representative Rice, want to answer?
I mean, I think partially the legally defined, you know, local to Vermont definition creates some
Ambiguity.
creates some more sort of necessary tracking that if you're not, the idea is that you can, a district can sort of say what local is to them and relatively easily say, oh, these things fit under there and these things don't. And maybe we're purchasing 30% of our food locally and get them into that base year grant without really having to do the hard tracking that is required under that legally defined.
So Representative Levitt, and then just with an eye on the clock and we have more time to schedule this afternoon for these conversations. While we've got Beth here, if there's any other questions about the language, make sure we covered that.
I guess I'm just confused because local to some schools is buying eggs from New Hampshire.
Exactly.
But it doesn't fit under the Vermont definition that we've been talking about of local. So that's where I'm feeling a dissonance.
Me too.
Because they're not getting reimbursed for they can call it local whatever they want because we're not.
But then it
getting
gets
money from
confusing
local.
because then we're talking about, it's just a little ambiguous to me, but I'll have more coffee and reread it.
I'm curious what you were going to say though to that, and you got.
I think I already said what I think I've already said what I was gonna say, which is just, if we're not providing reimbursements.
It doesn't matter.
They can call local what they wanna call local, where our definition comes in is where there's money attached.
Right,
Meal.
that's my concern as well. So then at some point though, there will need to be reconciliation between the records of their purchasing and the law. And what I hear is that
Oh, I see what you're saying. Are you talking about eligibility for the grant? And
yes,
that's AOE's, they have auditing authority.
very good, okay, sorry.
Yes.
Thank you.
One more piece
Yes.
that it sounds like maybe you got testimony on yesterday, so you don't need this. But there was also that question of, well, what are we doing with foods that are processed out of Vermont because there's no ability to process them here. So again, this is not an agency I work with. I have no idea if this language makes sense. But one way to get that information is to require a report, but it sounds like you actually got the AG's interpretation of how they are interpreting local to Vermont when there's no processing availability in the state. The one thing I will point out is that it's AOE who's administering this program, not the Agency of Agriculture, and it's a self-certification by the food producer that they meet the definition of local. So ensuring that everyone understands that's how the AG's office is interpreting it, that I assume if they're in the marketplace, assume is a dangerous word, but if you're in the marketplace and this is your livelihood, hopefully they understand that that's how the AG's office is interpreting the definition of local to Vermont. But we can certainly take section 7 out if you are comfortable with the information you have.
So I think we will, so when we come back to this, there's a couple of things that we've identified we want to have more conversation about. And this is one of them. The larger question is, do we want to ask the Agency of Education to do anything, to put anything in next year's study beyond what they've put in the last couple of years? And there is the recognition that that will require, effort, so time. And we did hear the testimony yesterday that obviously that has to be paid for somehow. If it's incidental work, then, and the agency is comfortable telling us that they can do that without, hiring somebody, as opposed to, we would have to hire somebody, that should play into our decision. But I think we wanted to try and get a sense of what are we after here? Is it really work that somebody else, that the agency should be doing rather than us? And if so, what, how would they be able to do that work? So we'll pick this up. Beth, thank you. We'll pick this up again later this afternoon. We can all be thinking about that. We will take a very short break here because Commissioner Goldstein, who's scheduled to testify next, has been patiently waiting there. Thank you. But let's just take 5 minutes.